Hello, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on protesting social segregation. And we're going to look particularly at the sit-in movement. In this conversation, we're going to look at the beginning of the sit-in movement, which occurred at Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. And then we're going to look at student involvement. This is a different a type of movement than what we've seen before with school desegregation and the Montgomery bus boycott. And so this is going to be, without question, a student-led movement, and we're going to look at the core rules for action, the movement's spread, the events in Nashville and Atlanta, and the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And then we're going to look at the meaning of the sit-ins. We're going to look at the motivating factors that lie behind the sit-ins, and then the effects of the sit-ins. So we want to begin with the question, why a sit-in? Why would Black Americans protest by sitting in at lunch counters and in various places that they are not permitted to be? Why this particular form of protest? In the Atlanta Constitution, there was an article written, An Appeal for Human Rights. And in that appeal, there was an attempt to describe the reasons for the sit-in movement. And this is what it said. The students who instigate and participate in these sit-down protests are dissatisfied, not only with the existing conditions, but with the snail-like speed at which they are being ameliorated. Every normal human being wants to walk the earth with dignity and abhors any and all prescriptions placed upon him because of race or color. In essence, this is the meaning of the sit-down protests that are sweeping the nation today. Today's youths will not sit by submissively while being denied all of the privileges, the rights, privileges, and joys of life. We want to state clearly and unequivocally that we cannot tolerate, in a nation professing democracy and among people professing Christianity, the discriminatory conditions under which the Negro is living in Atlanta, Georgia, supposedly one of the most progressive cities in the South. So that quote really lays out a broad foundation of why there would be these protests because of what we've talked about, these two separate societies, one white and one black. And so the reality is you have a place like a lunch counter in a variety store. These were very popular back in those days that would refuse to allow black citizens to sit down and order a cup of coffee or have a sandwich. They could often go into the store and buy things in the store, but they weren't allowed to sit at the lunch counters. And one black citizen in North Carolina, a man named Joseph McNeil, on January 31st, 1960, went into the Greensboro, North Carolina bus terminal and tried to be served at the bus terminal. And the response was, we don't serve Negroes. And so that night he met with three of his roommates, Ezell Baker Jr., Franklin McCain, and David Richmond. They're all pictured here. They were all students at North Carolina's Agricultural and Technical College. And they decided to do a sit-in protest at Woolworth's lunch counter the next day on February 1st. And so they went, and you can see a picture of them here. They sat down at the lunch counter. They requested service, and they were denied service, and they simply refused to leave. That was the essence of the sit-in movement, was to sit in at a lunch counter or go into some place that you're not allowed to be and just stay there, demanding to be served. And so that night, after this initial sit-in at Woolworth's lunch counter, very famous event, these students met, and they formed what they called the Student Executive Committee for Justice. And they agreed to nonviolence, the principles of Martin Luther King, Christian love towards anyone that they encountered in this protest, and they began to protest and gather other students to be involved in this in Greensboro. And obviously, there was a response. There were 45 arrests on trespass charges, and the response to that was Black citizens in Greensboro began boycotting the variety stores in general. They just said, we're not going in there. And ultimately, it was that action, the boycotting of the variety stores, that put so much pressure financially on on business owners in Greensboro that the leaders of the city actually conceded and allowed uh, Black citizens to be served at the lunch counter. One one thing that I think is really important here, notice that in this picture you have a Black man who is actually working behind the counter. There's a very interesting social dynamic here of allowing somebody to be in a situation with white people if you are working, if you are serving those people, but not allowing Black people to be there and be served along with other white people. It reminds me of the quote we said about eating together, and how back in the days of slavery, Barbara Salter McNeil said that back in the days of slavery is the reason why slave owners did not eat with their slaves, because of the leveling effect of and the commonality involved in eating together. So it's a very important um, beginning to this sit-in movement that occurred in Greensboro, North Carolina. And so as we talk about the student involvement in this particular aspect of the protest movement, of the civil rights movement, I want to ask the question, why students? It's very interesting. Students were not involved significantly uh, in the same to the same level earlier in the school desegregation and the Montgomery bus boycott. These were kind of totally different groups of people that were leading. I mean, certain student involvement, of course, but not led. This particular thing, the sit-ins, is going to be something that's initiated by students, but also something that students are going to be attracted to. And so my question is, why would students be attracted to this particular form of protest, the sit-in movement itself? One of the civil rights movement's groups that was organized in the 1940s, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, actually became significantly involved in the sit-in movement and was part of training students and preparing them for the sit-ins. And they developed what they called the rules for action. And here's some of what they said. To protect the skull, fold the hands over the head. To prevent disfigurement to the face, bring the elbows together in front of the eyes. For girls, to prevent internal injury from kicks, lie on the side and bring the knees upward to the chin. For boys, kneel down and arch over, with skull and face protected. This is very sobering to understand that the students involved in this were putting themselves at risk in a significant way. And we're going to talk more about that in just a second. But the abuse that the people took who were sitting in is quite frankly unbelievable. And so we need to understand the context of that, understand students deciding to do this, and truthfully, based on what's going on here, maybe students are the best people because of their youth, and just because they're younger and more able to take the kind of abuse that they're going to meet with as they engage this particular activity. So those core rules for action were used to train over 1,000 students to participate the in the sit-in movement. And some of the things that occurred as a result, a Houston protester was stabbed and beaten and had KKK carved in his chest and later hung. Black college in Frankfort, Kentucky was firebombed. 10 protesters were attacked with clubs and chains. and 10 wounded with gunfire in Biloxi, Mississippi. Police used tear gas and dogs in Jackson, Mississippi, and acid was thrown in the face of a protester in Atlanta. Um, Nonetheless, the movement spread to 78 cities. By August, more than 70,000 blacks and whites had participated in the sit-in movement. 3,000 had been jailed across the country. Um, some of the people that were jailed decided to do what they called jail-ins, which was choosing to remain in jail in protest rather than to pay the fines. That certainly was one of the more brutal aspects of this sit-in movement protest. It spread to other forms of sit-ins, kneel-ins, at churches, sleep-ins, at hotels, swim-ins, at polls, play-ins, at parks, watch-ins, at theaters. By the end of 1961, 200 cities in the Upper South and border states had begun to desegregate their businesses and social activities that people were trying to engage with this movement. But there were few victories in the Deep South. In Nashville, Tennessee, there was violence in a long period, over a long period of protests, where a number of very famous future civil rights leaders like John Lewis are going to be involved. But in Nashville, only the protesters were arrested. There was a very successful protest movement, sit-in protest movement in Atlanta. By September 27th of 1961, the city of Atlanta had been desegregated as a result. And the reading that the quote I used from an appeal for human rights that was in the Atlanta Constitution on March 9th is in large part influential in that. And so what we see in Atlanta is something that's very important because not only did they demand an end to segregation in restaurants, theaters, concert halls, and other public facilities, but as this picks up steam, and black protesters start to accomplish their goals of being able to go to the lunch counter, or go to the pool, or go to the park, or whatever other things they had been denied the opportunity to be involved in, then they're going to start to talk about enfranchisement of blacks, equitable law enforcement, jobs for blacks, equal education, equal housing. 33 in Atlanta, 33% of the population was black, but they could only live in about 16% of the houses because of housing segregation. They started to argue and protest for better health services. Only 680 of Atlanta's 4,000 hospital beds were available to black citizens. And so we start to see the broadening of the movement and the broadening of the conversation surrounding some of the events that occurred in Atlanta. One of the really important developments with regard to student involvement in the sit-in movement was the creation of a new civil rights organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or more popularly called SNCC. SNCC was formed officially with its new name in October of 1960 after a couple of months of work creating the organization. And one of the key reasons for the organization was because SNCC felt like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the NAACP were too cautious, and that there was a need for students to become more active in the movement and to press issues that those organizations were not willing to press. Ella Baker was a really significant factor in the development of this movement. She organized what was called the Youth Leadership Meeting in Raleigh, North Carolina on April 15th, 1960, which kind of got this process started. And the focus of Baker and other leaders within SNCC was a group-centered leadership, less of a hierarchical structure, of leadership, the way maybe some of the other civil rights groups were organized, and the the goal of transforming the social structure. This organization was highly focused on changing what uh, Black Americans could do in American society. Martin Luther King agreed with the formation of this organization. He threw his weight behind it. He advocated a new organization. He supported the ideas of selective buying, for example, that we saw were very effective in Greensboro. He supported the concept of the jail-ins, and he obviously advocated for the nonviolent aspect of SNCC. James Lawson uh, becomes an important SNCC leader, and he kind of pushes back a little bit against Martin Luther King, argues for the tactical benefits of more direct action, was very supportive of the student protest, and was very, very aggressive in rebuking the NAACP and the SCLC for being too timid. So you get a lot of different things going on with the development of SNCC. The important thing to understand here is this is a new group of leaders, a new generation of leaders, and a new philosophy of what it means to be a civil rights protester. So as we move to the last phase of our conversation on the meaning of the sit-ins, I want to think about for a minute what would we think the meaning of the sit-ins would be? What is lying in the background of this? What is motivating people to do something like this? I think it's fair to say that civil disobedience is a new step here. Um, you know, the Montgomery bus boycott was simply a refusal to ride a bus. That's not really civil disobedience. That's not breaking any sort of law or something you should or could potentially be arrested for, although that misuse of law enforcement was used there to do that. The school desegregation, that's simply following a court case that says you're allowed to go to a school. That's litigation. This is different. The sit-in movement is civil disobedience. It's going somewhere where you were told you cannot go because of the color of your skin. What's the meaning of all of that? What are the motivating factors and what are the effects of something like a sit-in movement? Roy Wilkins, in his testimony before Congress in 1960, said something really compelling. He asked congressmen, "How far do you drive each day? Where and under what conditions can you and your family eat? Where can they use a restroom? Can you stop driving for a reasonable day behind the wheel, or must you drive until you reach a city where relatives or friends will accommodate you and yours for the night? Will your children be denied a soft drink or an ice cream cone because they are not white?" I think I include this quote because Wilkins' testimony was incredibly compelling. He's simply bringing it into practical terms. And he's saying, look, if you just want to take a simple trip as a Black American in the South, you have to worry about where are we going to stay overnight? Which hotels are available to us? You have to worry about where are we going to go to the bathroom? Where you have to worry about all kinds of things. Where are we going to eat that other people do not have to worry about? It's a very practical understanding of the meaning of the sit-in movement. Ella Baker, who again was very important in the formation of SNCC, she put it like this: that the civil rights movement was something bigger than a hamburger. That the sit-ins were something bigger than a hamburger. They weren't just about getting a hamburger. They were to rid America of the scourge of racial segregation and discrimination, not only at lunch counters, but in every aspect of life. What Baker is saying, and what other Black civil rights protesters who involved themselves in the civil disobedience of sit-ins are saying, is that we want what everybody else has. We want to end racial segregation and discrimination. We want to be able to just live in American society like everyone else does. So what were the motivating factors? behind the sit-in movement. I've identified 5 of these with the help of Harvard Sitkoff, who wrote a wonderful book called The Struggle for Black Equality. And so the first one is people. One of the motivating factors were these protesters themselves had people in their lives that influenced them to do this. They had parents that had told them about other generations of people that had worked for civil rights. They had teachers that were talking to them about this. They were encouraged by whites who had become involved and become supportive. And there are more white Americans becoming supportive of the civil rights movement by this time. And of course, the influence of Martin Luther King. There's also a motivating factor of personal experiences. Things are changing. There are a number of young people that got the opportunity in the 1950s to serve in integrated armed forces because of the change in the segregation of the armed force, the desegregation of the armed forces. There are Black Americans because of the Great Migration who have experienced living in the North, and they've seen that there's some differences there, and we should apply some of the things we are able to do in the North to the South. There's going to be a lot of people coming from the North to the South to be part of these sit-in protests. There are larger events like the school desegregation that is occurring, and Montgomery bus boycott, desegregating of the buses. There is the African independence movement that's occurring. In Africa, a lot of the African nations were actually colonies of European countries. And we start to see them break away and establish independence. So these larger events are giving a motivating factor as to things don't have to be the way they've always been. Things can be changed, things can be improved. Then there's a big factor, which is impatience. Students that had grown up in an era of change, they had lived in cities. There's movement. People are moving from place to place. There's the development of the middle class. There's the change in kind of socioeconomic status. There's new ideas out there that we've talked about with regard to race. All of these factors raised aspirations and fueled hopes, but also created impatience. We have to do something. We have to do something that will affect change now. And then lastly, and I think most importantly, a motivating factor was they had a noble goal. The students had a noble goal to eradicate the stigma of being inferior in the South, being treated as inferior, as Roy Wilkins said, as having to live your life differently from everyone else on the basis that there's something different about you, which is, as we know, founded on the concept of racial inferiority. So there's this noble goal that they had of saying, you know what, the races, one is not superior to another. We're going to get rid of that stigma, and we're going to say that people are just people. So there are also important effects of the sit-in movement. We've identified 7 of them. The first is that the sit-in movement itself shamed the Black adult community to discard the passive accommodationist etiquette that had been the norm. As we've said before, the norm in Black society since the Civil War and even before in slavery is passivity. It's not active protest. And so what the students did here is going to shame the Black adult community into action. Secondly, it's going to push Black leaders, some of the civil rights leaders, to a new militancy, to a new level of militancy that they were not comfortable with before. Third, nonviolence, redemptive love, and the dignity of protesters created positive responses from white students. I can't emphasize enough the value of point 3 here, in that the way the protests are conducted and the leadership of Martin Luther King in kind of formulating the proper way to protest and to do this is going to have an effect on white Americans, and particularly on white students who are going to join this protest as a result of what they see in front of them. 4, The sit-in movement had the effect of demolishing the myth of Black contentment with the status quo, demolishing the idea that Blacks prefer to be separated, they prefer the system the way it is, and they're happy with the system as it is. Number five, it energized the movement. Young people bring in energy to whatever they involve themselves in. The young people involved in the sit-in movements energized other parts of the civil rights movement that had to do with other things. And sixth, the sit-in movement transformed the Black youth's image of themselves. That's really important here. It helped a new generation of Black Americans to see themselves differently than other people had been viewing them, or even that they had viewed themselves. And lastly, the success of the sit-ins, and they do have very direct success coming out of them, proved to whites that whites could and would accept integration. Success proved that this is possible. It gave hope. And so there's energy, myths being destroyed, all kinds of very positive things, new new activities within the civil rights movement, and the kind of movement away from passivity. Uh, Lots of new things coming out of the sit-in movement and the actions of the students in this part of the civil rights movement in the early years of the 1960s. So in this conversation, we have looked at the protest against social segregation. And we've looked specifically at the sit-in movement that began at a Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. We looked at how this movement attracted students. We looked at the core rules for action and how students were trained to deal with the abuse that they were going to face uh, in this part of the protest movement. We looked at the spread of the movement, the events in Nashville and Atlanta, and then we looked at the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, Ella Baker's involvement in that, and others, and the change sort of in direction of the civil rights movement that SNCC is going to initiate. Then we looked at the meaning of the sit-ins, the motivating factors that lie behind the sit-ins, and the effects of the sit-ins themselves. Some questions to consider with regard to the sit-in movement. Is civil disobedience wrong? From a biblical perspective, is civil disobedience wrong? There are going to be lots of religious leaders that are going to come hard against this part of the civil rights movement. This is different. This is a different form of protest. And so, from a biblical perspective, is civil disobedience wrong? Is there a better way? Is it wrong? Is it immoral? Is it a sin? Why or why not? Secondly, what is the proper Christian response to civil disobedience? So I want to turn back to the other side of this conversation. And we saw that picture in our presentation of uh, white counter protesters jamming themselves into the lunch counter and doing things like pouring ketchup or pouring mustard on the heads of the protesters. Unbelievable things that happen. We, of course, know that's wrong, but I want to work through what's the proper Christian response to civil disobedience. If you think civil disobedience is wrong, or what's a better response, or if you think it's wrong, what's the right response to it? That's a very complex question to think through. And then, thirdly, in your view, in what ways did civil disobedience and the response it provoked serve to eradicate and also deepen the stigma of racial inferiority? I want you to think through that because I think an argument could be made that this particular form of civil disobedience certainly could potentially eradicate the stigma of racial inferiority. I want you to think of how would it do that, but I would also want you to think about how it would also potentially deepen the stigma of racial inferiority, because I think both are possible if you think through the events and the responses and the response provoked by the event. Thanks for joining this conversation today. God bless you and have a great day.